In this news roundup of the week for the 5th of April 2024, the war between Israel and Hamas hits a major inflection point following the tragic airstrike against an aid convoy. Scotland introduces its new hate crime law and is instantly thrown into uproar and controversy, and America looks forward to the coming solar eclipse. Or the apocalypse, depending who you listen to. Now, it is one of the bitter injustices of war that while every human life is as valuable as every other human life, not all deaths are granted equal status and weight by the world. And so it is after a period when we know for a fact that many civilians have died in Israel and Gaza, the victims of the original inhuman attack and the what is euphemistically framed collateral damage of the months of war that has followed. Now, we don't know exactly how many have died. The figures provided come from agencies under the control of Hamas, so are typically inflated, but it's not disputed that it's a lot. They say 30,000, it may be 25, it may be 15. None of these would represent a small number as applied to a tragic death count. But it turns out that the deaths this week of a handful of innocent people echoed around the world and seems to have provided a significant tipping point in the political dynamics of how the conflict is playing out. Now, this, of course, was the deaths of 7 aid workers on Monday from World Central Kitchen as a result of Israeli airstrikes. These were predominantly foreign nationals, 3 Britons, a US-Canadian dual citizen, an Australian, a Pole and a Palestinian. This was a fair selection of important nations to be hit by the wave of fury and headline news coverage as a result of what happened. Not surprisingly, the attacks had targeted the survivors of each preceding strike until the members of the convoy were dead. The Israel Defense Force said that the strikes were a serious mistake, no kidding, and that those who approved the strike were convinced that they were targeting armed Hamas operatives and not WCK employees. But what an internal probe revealed today was that there had been significant errors and what are described as protocol violations, which led to multiple strikes hitting the aid convoy. 2 senior IDF officers have been fired in the immediate aftermath, a major and a colonel in reserve. The IDF said that multiple other top commanders will also be formally reprimanded. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seemed a little more relaxed about the outcome, at least initially, saying that this happens in wartime. Indeed, lots of tragic things happen in wartime. Some of them, however, have far-reaching consequences. Up until this point, there was already serious strain showing between Israel and its most important ally, the United States. The US had started staunchly behind the Israelis in the wake of the original October the 7th terrorist attacks, and a significant period where Israel's massive response aimed at wiping out Hamas as an operational force started to have obvious consequences. This week, the tenor became significantly more critical and more urgently so. In a telephone call between Biden and Netanyahu on Thursday, Biden said that the attack on the aid convoy had been intolerable, that the US policy with respect to Gaza would be determined by their assessment of Israel's immediate action on those steps. In particular, Israel needs to implement concrete steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. An early sign of response came as the Israeli Security Cabinet announced the approval of the reopening of the Erez crossing to allow more humanitarian aid in. Now, this attack was not the first time Israel had killed aid workers in the conflict. According to the UN humanitarian coordinator Jamie McGoldrick, at least 196 other aid workers have died in Gaza since October last year. It's just the one that, for various reasons, resonated most loudly across the world through all the noise, and it has changed the political dynamic, a process that was underway arguably already, but it has really made it starkly so, because this was previously a conflict that began pre-polarized. The supporters of Israel recognize that it's a country surrounded by enemies, so its tradition of reacting with overwhelming force when it is attacked is seen what it has to do to defend itself and to deter more attacks. So that support has often been dogged in the face of disapproval elsewhere in the world, as the record of US vetoing UN resolutions will attest. Meanwhile, those, including on the radical left in Biden's own party, who traditionally see Israel as the oppressor and identify themselves with the Palestinians, they were so well entrenched in their bunkers from the start, many of them even openly celebrated the original terrorist attacks. Once you have two sides so firmly bedded in, it's very hard to change the political dynamic, because they will see things that reinforce their own perspective, downplay the things, or just ignore the ones that are inconvenient to it. But that has been eroding over time, and this event has provided a catalyst now to demonstrably shift that supportive faction into a more defensive and critical posture. The question now is, what happens next? Will Benjamin Netanyahu significantly shift approach as the US has demanded, which would mean, for instance, not moving into Rafah and an early temporary ceasefire to help humanitarian aid be distributed? Netanyahu has historically been perfectly comfortable with defying US pressure. But this time could be different, given the scale of pushback worldwide that has been happening. Either way, we seem to be at a make or break moment. Someone gets provoked into an action that completely changes the game, or else someone gets their bluff called, and that would also substantially change the game. We're going to find out the answer to that fairly soon. Meanwhile, on April the 1st this week, Scotland's controversial new hate crime law was brought into force. The law had received significant sirens of alarm over the last year, particularly with a number of people concerned that it was so vaguely worded as to give a censor's charter against anyone who exercises free speech on a number of topics. It adds a new crime of stirring up hatred against groups with protected characteristics, which includes race, disability, religion, sexual orientation, and transgender identity. Under the Act, someone behaving toward an individual or communicating material in a way that could be considered by, quote, a reasonable person to be threatening or abusive could face up to 7 years in prison. Now, you might have noticed that's quite a vague definition. Who are these reasonable people? What if a number of reasonable people disagree? And one of the most commonly asked questions by the mainstream media in the run-up to the Act becoming law was, rather precisely, would this mean that Harry Potter author JK Rowling would be prosecuted for things that she had said on the subjects of women's rights and transgenderism? Well, Rowling was up for the fight. Within hours of the law taking effect, she posted a Twitter thread where she praised a number of relatively notorious characters, some of them currently in prison for rape or sexual assault, for being great and praiseworthy women. Then declared all that to be an April's Fool, saying, "Only kidding. Obviously, the people mentioned in the above tweets aren't women at all, but men, every last one of them." And she ended her final tweet with this: "It is impossible to accurately describe or tackle the reality of violence and sexual violence committed against women and girls, or address the current assault on women's and girls' rights, unless we are allowed to call a man a man. Freedom of speech and belief are at an end in Scotland if the accurate description of biological sex is deemed criminal." And she issued this challenge to Police Scotland: "I'm currently out of the country, but if what I've written here qualifies as an offence under the terms of a new act, I look forward to being arrested when I return to the birthplace of the Scottish Enlightenment. #ArrestMe." It's not known precisely how long senior figures at Police Scotland pondered that challenge. Not long, by all accounts, because very quickly the statement was issued that the Twitter thread did not qualify as criminal under the law. Kind of amazing they were able to move that fast, to be honest. Reportedly, within 24 hours of the act coming into force, they had received more than 3,000 reports against people. Now, of course, mostly those were from political activists on both sides. Some were submitting complaints about JK Rowling and other figures. Meanwhile, other people were submitting complaints about the Scottish First Minister who brought in the bill, Humza Yousaf. The Community Safety Minister, Siobhan Brown, said that people were making fake and vexatious complaints. Technically, of course, that was exactly one of the downsides predicted for the act. So it might just mean that people are starting as they mean to go on. Particular outrage was also felt by some that the bringing in of this measure came as police had promised to investigate every single complaint that was made under it. And this rather recently, after Police Scotland had said that they were so overworked, they now would not bother to investigate petty crimes where there was no CCTV evidence. So if someone steals ornaments from your garden, or damages your car, or steals your phone when you're in the street or in a park, the police won't investigate unless there's CCTV evidence. But if they tweet something hurtful, well, that's definitely going to get their full attention. It's been an interesting moment because generally this issue has two sides, foaming at the mouth with passion and anger, and everyone else mostly keeping their heads down and rather sniffing in disdain at what they describe as the culture warriors going on about free speech. But I've heard more mainstream journalists on this act starting to seriously argue that it really does seem to go further than you could defend, and giving JK Rowling a degree of credit, or at least unusual neutrality, in how they reported on her actions. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak backed JK Rowling's stance, saying that we should not be criminalising people saying common sense things about biological sex. Clearly that isn't right. We have, he said, a proud tradition of free speech. Whether that remains the case in the Scottish part of the Union remains to be seen over the coming months. Now, that's assuming we're all still here at that point, because not everyone's so sure about that. Because this coming week, the United States population is very excited about the prospect of a total solar eclipse. Lots of places that will be in the eclipse pathway have seen masses of bookings for people to be there for the big moment when it all goes dark. Now, as a by the by, I wondered to myself today, this is the sort of thing that in history, times gone past, there would be all sorts of conspiracy theories about. I must not be plugged into the conspiracy networks anymore because I hadn't really seen anything. Maybe, I thought, that means that even if we can believe that a pizza house is home for satanic acts by big-name politicians, we have at least progressed past the point of believing that an eclipse is anything other than, the moon moving between the Earth and the Sun. Stupidly, I decided to casually Google it and see. Well, that serves me right. I learned that Alex Jones, surprise, surprise, has been declaring to up to 1 million people on Twitter that the eclipse would see Masonic rituals worldwide intended to usher in the New World Order. I see. So how would a bunch of people doing rituals, timed with a big shadow passing over the United States, how would that bring in a New World Order? I mean, what's the actual mechanism for that? No, tell you what, it's a rhetorical question. Don't feel the need to answer it. But too late. Apparently, Jones also posted a video of a man speculating that various Texas and Oklahoma counties had declared a state of emergency in order to usher in a billionaire-led New World Order. This apparently was sparked by such counties which includes Texas's Travis County and Oklahoma's McCurtain County, issuing local disaster warnings. Because, of course, if I was a billionaire looking to take over the world as you do, Travis County, definitely where I would start. I guess. For example, Travis, focusing on an anticipated influx of thousands of tourists to watch the eclipse, thereby leading to such catastrophes as extreme traffic congestion, needed to announce the local disaster warning as the bureaucratic mechanism for the state being able to mobilise provisions in case such things should become a problem. Clearly, the stuff of the end of times. There is also, I learned, a NASA project based on Wallops Island, Virginia, to shoot rockets at the moon during the eclipse. Well, according to Dom Luca, tweeting to his 1.2 million followers, this project would see rituals, of course, Masonic, Satanic, Esoteric, Gnostic, Brotherhood of the Snake, and other occult-like groups, because the Masons alone is just so lightweight, they will be performing. Apparently, NASA's launches are so that they can study disturbances in the ionosphere when the moon eclipses the sun, which is obviously a very Brotherhood of the Snake kind of a thing to do. Others are saying that Carbondale, Illinois will be the epicenter of doomsday, because of course it will. It sits in the center of an imaginary X, made up of the path of the 2017 eclipse and then this one. In the meantime, if you're in the path of the eclipse this week, have fun, safely observing it. Once the dark moments have passed, you almost certainly won't find that the world has been taken over by billionaires. I mean, the rest of us in the world would probably notice, since the eclipse is only happening in the US at that time. And, we don't only exist when your sun is shining. At least, I think that's the case. My thanks as always to the people who support this channel on Patreon. As you know, I could not produce these videos without that support. If you want to add yours, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Have a great week, including the massive takeovers of humanity. See you next time.